That morning at Boise Wildlife Park was supposed to be just another peaceful day. Families walked the paths, children laughed, and no one sensed what was coming. Then the alarm blasted through the air, sending crowds running in panic. But in the middle of the chaos, an elderly woman stood perfectly still, her retired K-9 pressed close at her side. No one could understand why they didn't run until the tiger stepped into view and did something no one would have believed. Chimney. On most Saturdays, Boise Wildlife Park sounded like life going on as usual. Kids laughing too loud, stroller wheels rattling on the concrete paths, the faint rumble of traffic from the highway beyond the trees. That morning was no different. The air was sharp and clear, with just a hint of pine and the buttery smell of fresh popcorn drifting from the snack stand near the main gate. Grace Miller moved a little slower than the rest of the crowd, but then, at 78, she had earned the right. Her left hand curled around the crooked wooden cane her late husband had sanded and stained himself. Her right hand rested lightly on the leather harness of the German shepherd walking at her side. "Easy, Ranger," she murmured. "We're not in a hurry." Ranger's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice. He matched her pace without effort, big paws landing soft on the pavement, the old K-9 gait still there under the stiffness in his joints. The brass tag on his collar caught a glint of winter sun. Ranger, retired K-9 unit, Boise PD. They had just cleared the ticket booth and stepped onto the wide walkway that led toward the big cat exhibits when the park's sound system exploded to life. "Attention all staff. Code red. I repeat, code red. Secure all guests immediately. Tiger out of the habitat. This is not a drill." The voice was flat with forced calm, but the words themselves tore through the morning like glass. At first, there was a strange pause, as if the park needed a second to understand what it had just heard. Then the air split open. Somewhere behind Grace, a mother gasped, "Oh my God," and yanked her little boy so hard his balloon slipped from his hand and shot into the sky. A stroller jerked sideways and tipped, the baby inside screeching. Popcorn bags hit the ground like sudden snow. People started running with the clumsy, panicked speed of those who almost never ran. Let's go, move it!" A young security guard sprinted past, radio pressed to his ear, eyes scanning the tree line. "Get inside! Get under cover! Now!" Ranger stopped in his tracks, every hair along his spine lifted. His ears speared forward, his body sliding in front of Grace without her asking. He stood there, blocking her with his chest, eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the ticket booth, but on a stretch of path ahead where the trees grew a little thicker and the air felt suddenly heavier. "Ranger?" Grace whispered. "What is it, boy?" He did not look back at her. His nostrils flared. He inhaled deeply, then again, as if trying to pull something out of the air that no one else could smell. His tail was stiff, not tucked in fear, not wagging, just held straight behind him like a counterweight. The loudspeakers crackled again, closer this time. "All guests, please follow staff instructions and proceed to the nearest building. This is a code red situation. Do not remain in open areas. Staff, report all guest movements to control." People obeyed, for the most part. A group of teenagers who had been taking selfies near the flamingo pond dropped their phones into pockets and ran. Parents scooped up crying toddlers, half-dragged older kids who wanted to look back. Somewhere, a metal gate slammed down with a clang that echoed across the grounds. "Ma'am!" The security guard was back, breath puffing in white bursts, cheeks red under his ball cap. He skidded to a stop beside her. "Ma'am, you need to move. There's a tiger out. We've got to get you inside now." Grace didn't move. Her hand tightened just a fraction on Ranger's harness. Her blue eyes, still sharp despite the years, stayed on that same stretch of path, on the narrow bend where the concrete disappeared between two stands of fir. A tiger, she repeated softly, as if tasting the word. Are you sure? Yes, ma'am, very sure. The guard's voice climbed a little higher. We're working on containing it, but until then, I need you under a roof. Your dog, too. Ranger gave a low, rolling sound in his chest. Not a growl exactly, not the sharp bark he used to give on command back when he wore a badge, something in between. The guard flinched, then caught himself. He's all right, Grace said. He's just listening. Listening and smelling and remembering something she could not quite reach yet. That was what the feeling was, she realized. Something like a word on the tip of her tongue, only older, deeper, buried somewhere behind the years of doctor visits and pill bottles and quiet, lonely mornings at the kitchen table. Ma'am? The guard stepped closer, lowering his voice. Please, I don't want to scare you, but if that tiger comes around that corner, I can't hold him off with a radio. We need to move. Grace finally lifted her gaze to his face. The boy couldn't have been more than 22. His name tag read, Kyle, in block letters starting to peel at the edges. What's his name? She asked. The question caught him off guard. Whose name? The tiger, she said. Does he have a name? Kyle blinked. Yes, ma'am. Samson. Big old Bengal. Been here, I don't know, ages? But that really doesn't... The rest of his sentence never made it out of his mouth. The name hit her like a hard, clean blow to the chest. Samson. Her fingers slipped on the cane. Ranger shifted his weight instantly, pressing a little harder into her legs to keep her steady. For a heartbeat, the sounds of the park, the shouting, the crying, the orders crackling through radios, fell away. All she could hear was a memory of a winter wind rattling tin siding, a small, raw throat crying in the dark, a soft, clumsy body pressed against her flannel shirt, smelling of milk replacer and antiseptic and wild fear. Samson, she whispered. Ma'am? Kyle leaned in, not sure if she'd heard him or if she was going into shock. We really gotta... But her knees were no longer weak with age. They had simply locked in place for a different reason entirely. The name had reached back 20 years, grabbed hold of something she had wrapped in brown paper and shoved into the deepest corner of her mind. Ranger's head snapped a fraction to the right. He stared down the path, muscles coiling under his grizzled coat. A second later, Grace heard it too. Not a roar, not the full-throated bellow that rattled cages and made schoolchildren squeal and clap from behind glass. Something shorter, rougher, as if a larger sound had been swallowed halfway. It floated around the bend, rode the cold air straight into her chest. Control, this is Tower 1, a new voice said over Kyle's radio, tight with tension. Visual on Samson. He's moving along the main path toward the front plaza. Guests still in the open. Advise. Copy, Tower 1, another voice answered. All units, be advised. Samson is heading toward the main gate. Do not fire unless he threatens a civilian. Repeat, do not fire unless he threatens a civilian. Kyle's hand shook just enough that the radio crackled against his knuckles. He's coming this way, he muttered. Damn it! He grabbed for Grace's arm. Ranger's lips peeled back, a flash of yellowed teeth showing, and Kyle jerked his hand back on instinct. Ranger, Grace said quietly. The dog's mouth closed. The growl died. His body stayed between her and the bend in the path, but he did not lunge. I'm not going inside, Grace said. Kyle stared at her. I'm sorry? I said I'm not going inside. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was iron in it. You go do what they trained you to do, son. My place is right here. With a loose tiger? His voice cracked. Ma'am, that's insane. No, she said, eyes returning to the spot where the path curved out of sight. Her heart had begun to pound, not just with fear, but with a strange, aching recognition she hadn't felt in decades. No, I don't think it is. Ranger shifted his stance. He was still braced, still ready, but his tail flicked once, uncertain, as if he too was caught between two instincts that did not quite match. Around them, the flow of people had almost completely vanished. Staff had hustled the last stragglers into the restaurant, the gift shop, anywhere with four walls and a door that could be locked. The wide walkway that usually teemed with strollers and ice cream and bright Zoom apps was suddenly empty, except for a white-haired woman, her aging K-9, and a young guard who couldn't decide whether to follow orders or stay and watch whatever this was. Kyle swallowed hard. "I'm going to get in so much trouble for this," he whispered. "For what?" Grace asked. "For not dragging you inside," he said. "For standing here like an idiot." Grace's mouth twitched in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Then stand a little farther back," she said. "Idiots shouldn't have to stand in the front row." He huffed out a weak, nervous laugh in spite of himself and took 2 steps back. Ranger didn't budge. The wind shifted again. This time, even Kyle smelled it. Something musky and sharp, threaded with straw and old meat. The scent of a predator that had spent too many years behind fences. Then, around the bend, a shape appeared. Huge shoulders. Orange and black stripes dimmed a little with age. A heavy head carried low, eyes fixed on the open path ahead. Samson! He did not hurry. Each step was deliberate, the gait of an animal whose joints ached with every move, but whose mind was set on something beyond the pain. Behind him, the fir branches swayed gently, as if nothing at all in the world were out of place. From somewhere above, unseen, a sniper whispered into his mic, "I've got a clear shot." Down on the path, Ranger stood firm, Grace's hand resting lightly on his back. She felt the tremor under her palm, the poised electricity she had known from the stories about his working days, the moment between bark and bite, between command and action. Only this time he did not bark. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "Let's see who remembers what." And in that breathless space, with rifles trained, radios crackling, and a tiger closing the distant step by measured step, the world seemed to hinge on the stubborn stillness of one old woman and the quiet, conflicted loyalty of her dog. Long before crowds screamed and radios crackled with warnings, before Grace stood frozen on that walkway with Ranger braced in front of her, there had been a winter so cold the windows in her little Idaho cabin had frosted from the inside. Snow piled up against the doorframe, and the road that wound through the pines was nothing more than a silent ribbon of white. Back then, her hair was still mostly brown, her steps quicker, her hands steadier. She had been 58, still working part-time as a wildlife nurse for the county rescue network, tending to owls with broken wings and foxes caught in snares. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the kind of work that gave her days a simple purpose. It was nearly midnight when someone pounded on her door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Grace had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a pot of chamomile tea cooling on the table. She opened the door expecting a stranded driver or maybe one of the young rangers in training. What she found instead was Officer Brenda Lowe, cheeks wind-burned, jacket covered in clumps of snow, arms wrapped around a bundle that moved. "Grace, thank God you're up," Brenda gasped. "We need help, right now." Grace stepped aside without asking a single question. Brenda entered, carrying the bundle like it was made of glass. When she lowered it onto the couch and peeled back the wool blanket, Grace caught her breath. A tiger cub. No bigger than a house cat, trembling so hard its whole body shook, its fur, matted with melted snow and a smear of dried blood, stuck to its ribs. The eyes, barely open, were cloudy with shock, and the smell, milk replacer, fear, and the metallic tang of the trap that must have killed its mother, hit Grace like a punch of memory she didn't know she had stored. "Poachers got the mother," Brenda said quietly. "Found this little guy beside her. He wouldn't leave her body." Grace knelt, hands gentle but sure, as she checked the cub's limbs, jaw, heartbeat. He's dehydrated, hypothermic, and scared to death. She glanced up. Why bring him to me? You should have taken him to the center. The center generator's down. Roads are iced over. No one else has your experience. You're all we've got tonight. Grace sighed softly, not out of frustration, but out of the heavy awareness that some decisions were made long before they reached her doorstep. She fetched towels, warmed them by the stove, then wrapped the cub until only the small striped face was visible. When she held him against her chest, the tiny creature pressed its head under her chin, seeking warmth with blind desperation. "There you go," she murmured. "I've got you now." It was the first time he had heard her voice. Hours later, after formula warmed on the stove and soft humming under the dim kitchen light, the trembling eased. The cub fell asleep curled in the crook of her arm, nose buried against her flannel shirt. He made a small sound, not a cry, but something closer to a sigh. And even then, Grace felt something settle inside her, something she hadn't felt since her children were small and needed her in ways only a mother could understand. By dawn, she had already named him Samson. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm only Grace and the cub understood. Every 3 hours she warmed a bottle, tested it on her wrist, and fed him slowly so he wouldn't choke. She cleaned his bedding, kept him tucked near the stove on the coldest nights, rubbed his belly when he fussed. When he whimpered in his sleep, she lifted him close until the sound quieted. Sometimes he gripped her finger with a tiny paw, claws barely emerging, and she'd whisper, "Easy now, little man. You don't need to fight the whole world yet." Her husband Daniel would shake his head with a weary smile. "You've fallen for that little fella harder than you ever fell for me." "Maybe he's easier to train," she teased back, though the truth was she felt fiercely protective of the cub in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel understood. He always had. He brought her extra firewood, shoveled the walkway, and every now and then sat near her on the couch, watching Samson sleep with a look that said he knew exactly what this was doing to her heart. When winter softened into early spring, Samson began to take shaky steps across the living room rug. Grace sat on the floor and coaxed him forward with gentle claps. When he pounced too hard and accidentally scratched her, she feigned dramatic pain, clutching her arm and gasping. Samson froze, ears pinned, then crept closer with a small, confused churr. The next time he jumped, he did so with surprising control, as though learning his own strength 1 inch at a time. "He's a smart one," Daniel said, "too smart to stay here forever." Grace knew he was right. By the time Samson reached 10 months, he was already far too big to nap on her lap, though he still tried. His paws were huge, heavy, and clumsy when he climbed onto the couch beside her. His weight nearly toppled her backwards once, and for the first time she saw the truth written in the curve of his spine and the power under his growing muscles. He wasn't a house pet. He wasn't a wild orphan anymore. He was a tiger, a real one. Still, every night he crawled toward her, pressed his head into the crook of her neck, and made that soft, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a purr, but close enough to break her heart. She kept telling herself she had more time. Another week, another month. But wild things grow fast, and Samson grew faster than most. The day the county director called, the one who oversaw wildlife placement, Grace already knew what he would say. Boise Wildlife Park had a space for Samson, larger, safer, with proper enclosures and trained staff. It was a good place, a real place for him, a place she couldn't argue against. Still, when the transport truck pulled up and Samson sensed something changing, he pressed close to her legs, nudging her hand with a confused urgency that twisted her stomach. "It's just a ride, sweetheart," she murmured, though her own voice trembled. "Just a ride. They'll take care of you." But when they guided him into the crate, Samson let out a sound she had never heard from him, not fear, not anger, something like betrayal. Grace gripped the metal grate, trying to steady her breath as he pressed his muzzle against her fingers. "I'll come see you," she whispered. "I promise. I'll come back." Samson's eyes, still carrying that cub-soft look beneath the stripes, held hers until the truck door shut and the latch clicked. The engine rumbled. The truck pulled away. She stood in the snow as it disappeared down the road. Her breath fogged the air. Her hands, empty now, felt colder than the winter around her. She had no way of knowing that life was waiting to hit her hard and fast. That the man she loved would fall ill. That doctors would use words she didn't understand. That years would pass under the weight of sickness, grief, and the long, slow unraveling of a life she had tried her best to hold together. She had no way of knowing she would never make that visit. Nor could she imagine that 20 years later, on a walkway at Boise Wildlife Park, the tiger she once held against her chest in the dark of a snowstorm would be walking straight toward her again, because he had never forgotten the warmth of her hands or the sound of her voice. The ride that carried Samson away was only 20 minutes long, but for Grace it felt like someone had taken a piece of her and driven it down that frozen road. She stood there long after the transport truck disappeared, her boots sinking into the softening snow. The cold didn't bother her. What bothered her was the silence that followed, a silence that felt a little too much like a loss. For the first few days she moved around the cabin like someone learning the rooms again. Samson's bowl was still beside the wood stove. His bedding, still warm from the last night he slept, curled against it, lay in a heap she couldn't bring herself to wash. She told herself she would put everything away soon, but every time she picked something up, her hands stalled. It felt like closing a door she wasn't ready to close. Daniel watched her with that quiet patience older husbands develop. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had always understood her heart. When he came in from chopping wood and found her sitting on the couch with Samson's blanket folded on her lap, he didn't tell her to move on. He just sat down beside her and rested his palm on her back. "That little fella's in a good place," he said gently. "Bigger space, more room to stretch out. Folks who know what they're doing." Grace nodded, but her throat tightened. "I know," she whispered. "I just wish I'd had a little more time." "You gave him more time than he ever would have had." Daniel squeezed her shoulder. "That part matters?" It helped, but only a little. Spring thawed into summer. She told herself she'd go see Samson once Daniel was feeling better. The doctor visits had stacked up, each one leaving them with a new pill bottle or a new warning. She'd sit beside his bed and think, tomorrow. I'll go tomorrow. Samson's not going anywhere. But tomorrow always came with a reason to stay. Eventually, even Daniel saw the way her eyes drifted toward the door whenever the weather softened. One morning, after a long coughing spell that left him pale and winded, he caught her hand and said, "You should go, Gracie. He'd want to see you." She opened her mouth to agree. She really meant to. But then his breath hitched and his fingers trembled, and that was that. She couldn't leave him, not even for an hour. Months passed like that. Slow, heavy months filled with worry pressed between brief flashes of peace. When she finally stood over Daniel's hospital bed, holding his hand as the monitors dimmed and the room grew still, she whispered through tears, "Tell him I'm coming soon. Tell him I didn't forget." But grief doesn't leave much room for promises, and after Daniel was gone, Grace found herself going through the motions of life like someone climbing a hill with rocks in their pockets. She meant to visit Samson. She told her daughter Linda that she would. She even drove to Boise Wildlife Park once, sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, then turned the car around. The fear wasn't that Samson wouldn't remember her. The fear was that he would. Her doctor visits became more frequent. Her bones ached more. A cough settled in her chest that no medicine quite softened. After one long appointment filled with bad news and quiet nodding, she returned home, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at a photograph tucked inside a cookbook. It showed a striped cub sleeping on her lap, one little paw resting on her wrist. She slid the photo back into the book and closed it. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she whispered to the empty room. "I don't want to upset your life. Maybe you're happier without me confusing things." Years slipped away, one by one. Grace's world grew smaller. Church on Sundays, coffee at the diner with an old friend, afternoons spent reading with Ranger curled at her feet. She still thought of Samson sometimes, always quietly, always with that same tightness in the chest. On her 78th birthday, Linda surprised her with a small celebration. Ranger got extra treats, and Grace tried to smile while her grandkids brought cupcakes and handmade cards. Later that night, after the house had gone still, she sifted through a drawer of old papers and found a pamphlet from Boise Wildlife Park. It was faded around the edges, a picture of a Bengal tiger on the front. She traced the animal's outline with one finger, wondering if Samson still walked with that same clumsy sway he had as a young cub, wondering if his eyes had grown colder with age, wondering if he still slept curled up with his paws tucked under, like he used to do beside her wood stove. The next morning, she woke with a strange pull in her chest, not pain, not fear, just a feeling like she needed to go somewhere she had avoided for too long. She didn't tell Linda why she wanted to visit the park. She just asked quietly if her daughter could drive her, and if Ranger could come along. "I just want some fresh air," she said. "It might do me good." Linda agreed. Ranger seemed to sense something too. He stayed closer to her that morning, following her movements with an alertness she hadn't seen since his working days. She had no way of knowing that Samson, in his own part of the park, had begun pacing that morning, nosing the air as though a long-lost scent had finally returned to him after 20 silent years. Nor could she know that a careless mistake by a young intern would soon crack open a door that had been closed for 2 decades. What she did know, what she felt deep in her bones, was that something was shifting, some old thread pulling taut again. She didn't yet understand why Ranger kept glancing toward the tree line as they entered the gates. She didn't yet understand why her heart beat a little faster when she stepped onto the main walkway. But she would. Soon enough, she would. Shawnee. The drive to Boise Wildlife Park that morning felt longer than usual, even though it was only 20 minutes from Grace's neighborhood. Maybe it was the way the winter light fell across the snow-dusted fields, pale and thin, like something worn down by years. Maybe it was the way Ranger kept shifting in the back seat, letting out soft, restless breaths, as though he sensed something waiting at the end of the road. Linda hummed along with the radio to fill the quiet, but even she glanced at her mother now and then, noticing how still Grace sat, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You sure you're feeling up to this?" Linda asked as they turned into the park's entrance. "I'm fine, honey," Grace said. "Just want to stretch my legs." Her voice was gentle, but the words felt strangely heavy, as if they were carrying more weight than Linda realized. When they parked, Ranger hopped out with an energy he hadn't shown in months. He stood tall, sniffing the cold air, tail held stiff behind him. Grace steadied herself on her cane and let her hand rest on the back of his neck. "Easy," she whispered. "We're just here to look around." The path leading from the parking lot to the ticket booth wound between tall fir trees, the branches whispering overhead. Families moved past them in loose groups, talking, laughing, unaware of how quietly the day's path was already bending toward something none of them could have imagined. Grace paid for their entry, tucked the stubs into her coat pocket, and stepped onto the main walkway. Ranger slowed. His ears twitched. His nose lifted. She frowned and leaned a little closer. "What is it, boy? We haven't even passed the otter pond yet." But Ranger didn't look toward the pond. He didn't look toward anything familiar at all. Instead, his body angled toward the far end of the park, where the big cat habitat sat behind tall fences and thick glass. He gave a low, humming sound deep in his chest, one she hadn't heard since his days tracking suspects in back alleys and abandoned sheds. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't warning. It was recognition of something he couldn't yet place. Before she could ask again, a cold gust swept through the walkway, carrying a scent so faint, so distant, she almost missed it. A dry, musky smell, earthy, wild, edged with something that tugged at a corner of her memory she hadn't dared open in decades. She stopped walking. Ranger stopped too, eyes fixed on the same direction. "Mom," Linda asked, turning back. "You okay?" Grace swallowed. Her heart was beating faster now, but not in a way she understood. "Yes," she said, though the word came out thin. "Let's just take our time." They moved toward the central plaza, where a winter festival stand had been set up. Hot cider, kettle corn, a few wooden benches covered with a dusting of frost. Kids chased each other around the frozen fountain. A couple posed for pictures near a carved wooden moose statue. Everything felt ordinary, almost comfortingly so. Except for Ranger. He wouldn't sit, wouldn't relax. His body stayed tight, alert, each breath deeper than the last. His gaze kept dragging back toward the path leading to the predator enclosures. Grace followed it with her eyes. A group of interns were wheeling cleaning carts toward the rear service gate, talking loudly, laughing like people who hadn't yet learned how quickly things could go wrong. One of them, young kid, probably 20 at most, kept glancing at his phone, typing too fast with one hand while pushing the cart with the other. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. The kind of distraction on his face was something she'd seen 100 times in younger people who assumed the world would pause while they texted. "Mom?" Linda said again, softer this time. "Do you want to sit for a bit? You look like you're thinking about something." "I am," Grace murmured. She couldn't quite explain it. It wasn't just the smell on the wind. It was the way the air seemed to press in around her, charged with a feeling she hadn't felt since a winter night decades ago, when a ranger had carried a trembling cub into her warm living room. The memory rose so swiftly she had to grip her cane a little harder. The cub's tiny heartbeat against her chest, the rumble of the wood stove behind them, the soft, uncertain sound he made when he first settled into her arms. She blinked hard and steadied herself. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," she said again, though even she didn't believe it. "Let's keep moving." They hadn't taken 10 steps when a sharp burst of static cut through the air, loud, abrupt, unmistakable. Not the friendly chatter of walkie-talkies usually heard at the park. This was tighter. Urgent. "Control, we need a status check on Habitat C." Another voice snapped back. "Copy. Tyler reported finishing the sanitation run, proceeding to verify locks." A beat of silence, then a note of tension. "Tyler, confirm the latch is secure." A faint voice replied, too small to catch every word. Then, "Looks like it's closed." "Yeah, I think it—" The radio cut out. Ranger stiffened, his ears shot upright. The wind shifted again, harder this time, almost purposeful. The scent that followed hit Grace square in the chest. Stronger now. Richer. Familiar in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to her bones. "No," she whispered, almost inaudible. It couldn't be. Linda didn't hear her, but Ranger did. He pressed closer to her leg, eyes fixed toward the bend in the trail that led deeper into the park. His tail lowered, not in fear, but in anticipation, the kind he used to show when he caught a scent he knew. Somewhere beyond them, the first shouts rang out. Guests rushing past, staff yelling instructions, a crackling announcement blaring overhead, the beginning of the chaos that would soon send families scrambling for shelter. But Grace barely heard any of it, because the scent on the air had opened a door she thought she had sealed years ago. A door to a room filled with flannel blankets, warm milk, frightened cries, and a promise she once whispered into the fur of a cub who trusted her more than anything else in the world. A promise she had never kept. Ranger let out a soft sound, half whine, half question, as if asking her whether she felt it too. She did. And even before the alarms began to echo across the park, before the words "Code Red" tore the calm morning apart, she realized the impossible truth settling like gravity in her chest. Samson wasn't just loose. He was looking for something, or someone, and somehow, impossibly, unbearably, he had found her scent first. The alarms hadn't finished echoing across the park when the first wave of people surged past Grace and Linda, a blur of winter jackets, scattered maps, and frightened voices. A toddler cried somewhere behind them. A father shouted for his son. A teenage girl stumbled in panic, dropping her phone as she ran. Ranger stayed pressed to Grace's leg, his body tight, his eyes locked on the path where the air had grown strangely still. "Mom, we need to go," Linda said, one hand gripping Grace's arm. "Seriously, this is dangerous. We have to move." Grace didn't answer. Her breath came shallow, not from fear, but from a kind of recognition she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. She'd heard that sound. She knew that scent. Somewhere deep down in a place she hadn't touched in 20 years, something old and aching had woken up. A sharp voice broke through the chaos. "Ma'am, you have to evacuate!" It was Kyle, the young security guard from earlier, sprinting toward them with his radio clutched in one hand. His face was pale, eyes wide, breath coming fast. "The tiger is loose," he said, stopping just short of grabbing Grace's arm again. "Please, you need to get inside a building. Now." "It's Samson, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Kyle blinked at her, thrown off. "Yes, but that doesn't... He's unpredictable. He's big, he's fast, and he's scared." He gestured sharply at Ranger. "Your dog needs to be moved too. If that tiger sees movement, anything could..." Ranger let out a low rumble, not directed at Kyle, but at the path ahead. His muscles shifted under his coat, old instincts rising to the surface. He wasn't preparing to attack. He was bracing, rooting himself, positioning between his person and whatever was coming. Grace placed a trembling hand on his back. "Easy, boy." The loudspeakers crackled again, the voice strained now. "All units, respond to Sector C immediately. Guests still unaccounted for. Tranquilizer teams in position. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." From above, on top of the cafe roof, the gift shop awning, and the maintenance building across the plaza, Grace saw movement. Officers setting up long rifles, scopes glinting in the cold light, yellow-jacketed staff guiding terrified guests into buildings, radios chirping nonstop. It reminded her of the day they'd taken Samson away, all those years ago. The hard faces, the quiet urgency, the sense that something was being done for safety, even though it felt like loss. "Linda," Grace said softly, "go with the others. Take Ranger with you." "The hell I will," Linda snapped, gripping her mother harder. "I'm not leaving you out here alone with a loose tiger." Ranger looked between them, sensing the tension, but he didn't move. He stayed exactly where he'd planted himself, front legs stiff, body aligned like a living shield. Then came the sound that froze everything, a deep rumbling breath, heavy, slow, familiar. Every head turned. At the far end of the walkway, where the path curved gently around a stand of fir trees, the air parted. A massive striped shape slipped into view, shoulders rolling with age, steps measured and deliberate. His coat, once bright orange, had faded in places to the muted color of dried wheat. But his eyes, those amber molten eyes, cut through the distance and found the open stretch of concrete ahead. Samson. He didn't roar, he didn't charge. He simply walked as though the world around him didn't exist. as though alarms and humans and rifles weren't worth a second thought. "Tower 1, visual confirmed," a voice whispered from above. "Sampson is moving along the main path. He's heading toward the plaza. I have a clear shot if needed." Another voice answered sharply. "Hold your fire unless he poses direct threat. We are trying to contain, not kill." Linda clutched Grace's arm so tightly the knuckles went white. "Mom, please!" But Grace barely heard her, because Sampson, her Sampson, had stopped moving. His head lifted, his nose twitched. The wind, as if obeying something older than luck, shifted again and carried her scent directly to him. He froze, not like a predator marking prey, not like a beast calculating attack. He froze like someone recognizing a song he hadn't heard in 20 years. "Control," a sniper murmured. "The tiger has locked onto something. Advise." "Locked onto what?" "An elderly woman and a German shepherd." "Get her out of there." Kyle lunged forward. "Ma'am, please." Ranger moved first. He stepped directly in front of Grace, body braced, ears pinned forward, eyes never blinking. But he wasn't snarling. He wasn't warning Sampson away. Instead, his tail gave a single cautious sweep, the kind he used to show when he recognized another working dog on the street. Kyle stared in disbelief. "Why is he wagging his tail?" Grace answered without looking away from Sampson. "Because he remembers something too." The tension stretched across the plaza like a wire drawn tight. A mother cried inside the cafe. A tourist whispered a prayer. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sampson took one slow step forward. Rifles clicked as safeties disengaged overhead. "Do not fire," the radio hissed. "Not unless he lunges." Ranger lowered his body, not in submission, but in steady, deliberate readiness, like he had decided that whatever happened next, he was staying in front of Grace, no matter the cost. "Sampson?" Grace whispered, the words slipping out of her before she could stop it. Sampson lifted his head fully. His ears flicked. And then, unbelievably, a soft, fractured sound rolled from his throat. Not a roar, not even close. More like the broken cry of a scared cub pressing its face into a flannel shirt years and years ago. Grace's eyes blurred. Kyle's breath caught. "No way." From the maintenance roof, the sniper whispered, "What the hell was that?" Sampson stepped closer. Another step. His tail hung low, not swaying. His paws landed heavy but controlled, as though he remembered a lesson about gentleness from long ago. Ranger didn't growl this time. Instead, he let out a quiet whine, his body trembling, not with fear, but with some confusing, impossible recognition of his own. "Mom," Linda breathed, voice breaking, "tell me he's not walking toward you." Grace didn't answer, because she already knew the truth. The years hadn't erased her scent. The distance hadn't scrubbed her from his memory. And the moment the wind carried that old, familiar trace toward Sampson's keen senses, something inside him had stirred awake. Something that no fence, no handler, no passing time had ever replaced. Sampson wasn't walking toward prey. He wasn't confused or panicked or lost. He was walking toward home. For a long, trembling moment, no one moved. Sampson stood at the edge of the plaza, his massive frame rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Grace could see now that age had settled into his joints, each step heavier than the last, but his gaze, steady, amber, unblinking, held the same quiet searching she had seen in a much smaller pair of eyes 2 decades ago. It was a look that didn't belong to a predator. It belonged to someone waiting for an answer. Above them, rifles stayed locked in place, but the men behind them were rattled. One sniper whispered into his mic, "He's not posturing, he's—" "I don't know what this is." "Control, advise," another snapped. His voice shook. "Do we take the shot if he gets within 10 feet? The radio crackled. "Negative. Hold positions. Wait for Dr. Carter." Ranger gave a hesitant whine and glanced back at Grace, as if asking her permission to stay where he stood. She rested a hand on his back. "It's all right, boy," she murmured. "You know him better than they do." Kyle's radio chirped again, startling him enough that he dropped his hand from his holster. "All units," the voice said. "Tranquilizer Team Alpha is en route. Maintain visual. Do not, repeat, do not engage unless Samson charges." Kyle ran a shaky hand down his face. "He shouldn't be walking like that," he muttered. "That's a 400-pound animal. He should be pacing, roaring, doing something that makes sense." But nothing about this made sense. Samson took another step, slow, heavy, thoughtful. Ranger lowered himself closer to the ground, chest pressed into the concrete, head tilted just so. It wasn't submission. It was something else, something cautious and strangely hopeful. An old K-9 meeting a memory he didn't quite understand. Grace stepped forward. "Mom!" Linda grabbed for her arm, but Grace moved out of reach. It wasn't fast. Nothing she did these days was fast, but it was sure, a decision pulled from some deep place that didn't care about danger or common sense. Kyle made a sound between a gasp and a curse. "Ma'am, please, don't do this!" But Grace wasn't listening to him. She was listening to the quiet, broken, almost childlike sound coming from Samson's chest. A sound she hadn't heard since he slept, curled against her, breathing in that soft, uncertain rhythm of an animal learning that the world wasn't going to hurt him anymore. "Samson," she whispered. His ears twitched. A breath caught somewhere above them, maybe a sniper, maybe a staff member who'd forgotten how to breathe. Ranger stayed low, but didn't growl. His tail brushed the ground once. Another sign. Another strange, impossible signal. Samson stepped forward. Kyle lifted his radio. "Control, the Tiger is approaching the civilian. I need authorization to—" "Stand down!" a voice cut in sharply. "Dr. Carter is almost there." Almost there wasn't fast enough for the officers nearby. Two of them sprinted into the plaza, tranquilizer rifles raised. One shouted, "Ma'am, get back now! Move away from the animal!" Ranger barked once, sharp, startling, forcing both officers to halt just long enough for Samson to close the distance another few feet. Grace didn't flinch. She lifted a hand, palm out, as though trying to call something calm into the air itself. "It's all right," she said quietly. "He won't hurt me." One of the officers swore under his breath. "You can't know that." "Yes," she said softly. "I can." Samson stopped only a few feet away. He lowered his head until it was nearly level with her waist. The world around them blurred, the shouting, the orders, the radios, the winter festival decorations knocked over by fleeing guests. All of it became background noise to a moment that felt impossibly still. Grace reached out. Her hand trembled. Not from fear, those nerves had been burned out of her years ago with grief and time, but from the weight of 20 winters without him. When her fingers brushed the fur at the top of his head, Samson exhaled, a long, trembling breath that shivered through his entire frame. He leaned into her touch. The plaza fell silent. Kyle whispered, "Jesus." Linda clapped a hand over her mouth. Even the snipers seemed frozen, scopes trained, but fingers far from triggers. Samson nudged her palm with a gentleness that didn't belong to a creature with jaws powerful enough to crush bone. His eyes closed halfway, and for an instant, just an instant, he pressed his head into her hand like he had done as a cub, back when his whole world had fit inside a tiny living room beside a wood stove. Ranger rose slowly and moved closer, pressed himself against Grace's other side, creating a triangle around her. A strange protective circle only the three of them seemed to understand. He sniffed Samson cautiously, then let out a small rumbling sound that didn't quite match any bark she'd heard from him before. Grace stroked Samson's cheek, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have come sooner." A door slammed somewhere behind them. Dr. Emily Carter rushed into the plaza, her coat half-zipped, her breath visible in frantic bursts. "Nobody move!" she shouted, hurrying forward. "Nobody touches that trigger." She reached the officers and shoved their rifles down herself. "Do you want to put a bullet in the most extraordinary thing this park has ever seen?" she hissed. "Lower them now." Samson didn't react to her voice. His focus stayed locked on Grace, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away even for a second. Dr. Carter stared, stunned. "My God," she whispered, "he's choosing her?" Kyle whispered back. He walked past everyone else, straight to her. The radios crackled desperately. "What's happening? Do we contain the animal? Do we sedate? Dr. Carter, respond." She didn't answer immediately. She was too busy watching Samson lean closer, brushing his massive head against Grace's shoulder with heartbreaking care. "This isn't a containment situation," she finally said into her radio, her voice low but steady. "This is something else." "Something else?" "Yes," she swallowed. "We need to shut down the plaza, clear all non-essential staff, no shots fired, no tranquilizers. I'm authorizing protective observation only." "That's a violation of protocol," the voice warned. "I don't care. Samson is responding to a memory, a bond. I'm not breaking that." Samson pressed his forehead against Grace's arm. Ranger pushed in tighter, as if helping her hold. His weight. Grace closed her eyes. For the first time in 20 years, the world felt whole again. The hours that followed moved with a kind of stunned quiet, as if the entire park was holding its breath. Once Dr. Carter made her call, staff moved with an urgency that tried not to look like panic. They cleared the plaza, ushered terrified guests into buildings, and sealed off every entrance with metal shutters normally used only during storms. Samson never flinched. He stayed pressed beside Grace, as if the world around them had shrunk to a small circle of concrete and winter air where only the three of them existed. When tranquilizer teams finally formed a perimeter, Dr. Carter stepped between them and the tiger, palms raised. "You shoot him, and you're shooting history," she warned. "Nobody moves unless I say so." The officers hesitated, uneasy but obedient. They weren't trained to defy a lead veterinarian when she spoke with that kind of conviction. And it was clear, painfully clear, Samson wasn't a threat. Not to the woman who now kept her hand on his cheek as though holding him together. It took nearly 20 minutes to move Grace, Ranger, and Samson into the veterinary wing. Not because Samson resisted, but because he refused to walk unless Grace walked beside him. When she slowed, he slowed. When she paused to catch her breath, he lowered his head as if encouraging her forward. Ranger stayed on her other side, occasionally glancing up as if making sure she was steady enough to continue. Inside the building, they guided her into an observation suite, normally reserved for endangered animals recovering from surgery. Dr. Carter had staff roll mats and blankets onto the floor, dim the overhead lights, and bring in portable heaters so the room wouldn't echo with its usual clinical chill. This wasn't a procedure room now. It was something gentler, warmer, stranger. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Dr. Carter said, her voice low, almost reverent. "We'll keep the door sealed, and no one comes in unless absolutely necessary." Grace eased onto a padded mat, cane set aside. Her knees protested, but she ignored it. Samson settled beside her immediately, lowering himself with the careful, almost delicate movements of an old creature who knew his own weight could break someone fragile. His huge head came to rest on her lap. Ranger lay down against her back, forming a protective curve around her other side. The three of them fit together like pieces of a memory finally snapped back into place. Linda watched from behind the observation glass, one hand pressed to her mouth. "She never told me," she whispered to no one in particular. All these years, she never said a word about raising a tiger. Dr. Noah Reed stood beside her, scribbling notes but barely looking down at the page. His eyes stayed fixed on the trio inside the room. "Some bonds don't need explaining," he murmured. "They just need time." But time was what none of them had anymore. In the days that followed, the routine settled into something so quiet and sacred that even the maintenance crews lowered their voices when walking near the hallway. Every morning, a staff vehicle picked up Grace, Ranger sitting upright in the passenger seat like he had been assigned a post. Some days, Grace could walk the short hallway into the observation suite. Other days, she needed a wheelchair. But she always came. And Samson always waited. At first, he positioned himself near the reinforced glass, scanning the hallway every few seconds, as if expecting her at any moment. When he heard the faint tap of her cane or the familiar jingle of Ranger's collar, he rose with a sound that vibrated deep in his chest, a rumble equal parts relief and longing. He lay beside her as soon as she settled onto the mat. Not on her, not pushing against her, but near her, close enough for their breaths to share the same slow rhythm. Ranger curled at her other side, sometimes resting his head on Samson's flank, sometimes nudging Grace's hand until she let it rest on his shoulder. He had once been a working dog, trained to assess threats, track criminals, and protect officers. But in this room, with these two, he took on a different duty entirely. He wasn't guarding her from danger. He was guarding the space where Grace and Samson existed together again. Visitors and reporters begged for a glimpse, but Dr. Carter denied every request. "This isn't for spectacle," she explained. "This is their time." That didn't stop rumors from spreading. The tiger who remembered, the woman he waited 20 years for, the K-9 who chose loyalty over instinct. Someone had filmed the brief moment in the plaza before staff shut down the area, and the footage spread online like wildfire. People argued on social media about whether it was staged, whether the tiger was drugged, whether the woman was foolish or brave. But those in the veterinary wing saw the truth plainly. This wasn't a miracle. It was a reunion. During the quiet afternoons, Grace would talk softly, her fingers combing through Samson's coarse fur. She told him about Daniel, about the grandkids, about Ranger's early years on the force. Sometimes she apologized without meaning to, little murmured confessions that slipped out between breaths. "I should have come sooner. You must have thought I abandoned you. I should have tried harder." Each time, Samson responded with a low, steady rumble, the same sound he used to make as a cub when she hummed him to sleep. And Ranger, who had never been a sentimental dog, would rest his chin on her thigh with a sigh, as if reminding her she wasn't alone in any of this. But even in these peaceful moments, the shadow of urgency lingered. Grace's color grew paler, her steps slower. Linda noticed the way her mother's breath hitched when she stood, how long she needed to sit before walking again. She confronted Dr. Carter in the hallway one morning, voice trembling. "How bad is it?" "She told us the cancer was stable." Dr. Carter hesitated. "Your mother is extremely fragile, more than she's letting on." "Will she be okay for Christmas?" The vet didn't answer immediately. "I think she's holding on because she needed to see him again." "And what about Samson?" Dr. Carter closed the file she'd been reviewing. "Old, arthritic. His organs are tired. Tigers rarely live this long, even with excellent care." "So he's waiting too?" The vet met her eyes. "Maybe." As the days passed, the staff noticed something else, something that left even the skeptical ones quiet. When Grace was there, Samson's appetite improved. His posture straightened. He stayed alert, his tail flicking gently whenever her voice filled the room. But on the rare day she was too tired to come, he barely moved. Didn't eat, didn't drink, just lay there, staring at the door. Ranger acted the same way, restless if she didn't arrive, calm only when he could curl against her side again. It was as if both animals had decided she was the gravity holding them to this world. One evening, long after visiting hours should have ended, Grace sat between the two old creatures, their breaths soft and synchronized. She rested her palm on Samson's broad forehead and whispered, "We've all gotten so old, haven't we? You, me, and this poor, tired boy." Ranger nudged her hand with his snout, as if offended at being lumped into the category of tired. Grace laughed, quiet, breathy, but real. For a moment, under the warm lights of the observation suite, the three of them looked like they'd simply found their way back home. A place where time paused. A place where regret softened. A place where loyalty had chosen to stay a little longer. But time wasn't pausing. It was gathering itself, preparing its final turn. And though none of them said it out loud, not even Linda, who lingered by the window long after others left, the truth was as present as the steady hum of the heaters. Grace, Samson, and Ranger were walking into their last chapter together. The morning began quietly, but there was something in the air, a heaviness, a hush, the kind of stillness that settles before the snow falls. Ranger sensed it first. He had slept beside Grace's bed the night before, resting his chin on the quilt, watching her with the patience only an old dog knows. When she stirred just after dawn, he lifted his head, ears trembling, and let out a low, uncertain whine, not the sharp, controlled sound of a working dog, something gentler, something sad. Linda heard it from the hallway. She opened the bedroom door and froze at the sight of her mother struggling to sit up, breath shallow, face pale with a kind of soft acceptance. There was no urgency in Grace's movements, only a quiet determination, as though she knew exactly what she had left to do. "You don't have to go today," Linda whispered, sitting beside her. "You barely slept. You're exhausted. Just rest." Grace shook her head. He's waiting, and Ranger knows. She reached for the old shepherd's head, brushing her fingertips along his muzzle. "He's been telling me all night." Linda wanted to argue, to insist on a hospital, on oxygen, on anything that would keep her mother a little longer. But the look in Grace's eyes was the same one she had seen the first day Samson stepped into the observation room and laid his head in her mother's lap. It was a look that didn't belong to fear. It belonged to purpose. So she helped her dress, thick sweater, wool coat, scarf wrapped gently around her neck, and she guided her out to the waiting transport van. Ranger climbed in first, settling against her legs, never taking his gaze off her, as though counting each breath. When they arrived at the veterinary wing, the hall was already dimmed. Someone, maybe Dr. Carter, maybe one of the night staff, had laid fresh blankets on the floor of the observation suite. A heater hummed softly in the corner. The room felt warmer than usual, almost like it understood what the day was about to hold. Samson was already awake. He stood when the door opened, though the effort clearly pained him. His hips shook, his breath came rough, dragging through old lungs that had carried him far longer than most tigers ever lasted. But the moment he saw Grace, every line of discomfort on his face eased. He moved toward her with a gentleness that defied the weight of his old body. Linda wheeled her mother into the center of the room, and Ranger pressed close. Grace reached out with a trembling hand. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered. Samson lowered himself onto his belly, inching forward until his head rested beside her knee. Ranger lay down on her other side, curling himself into her as naturally as breath itself. The three of them formed the same shape they had made so many times these past months. A small, quiet circle of fur, warmth, and years-old loyalty. Grace exhaled slowly. "You boys look tired," she murmured. "But I guess we've all been tired a long time." Dr. Carter and Dr. Reed stood behind the glass, speaking in hushed tones. "She doesn't have long," Carter said. Reed nodded. "And Samson?" The vet didn't look away from the tiger. "He's only still here because she is." Inside the room, Grace brushed her palm along Samson's cheek. Her hand trembled halfway through the motion, and Ranger shifted immediately, pressing his head beneath her wrist to steady her. "You always tried to take care of me," she whispered to the dog. "You and this big old boy here." Ranger's tail thumped once, weak, slow, but full of meaning. Samson lifted his head an inch and nudged her gently, the same gesture he used to make as a cub when he wanted reassurance. Grace slid her fingers through the fur along his jaw, feeling the warmth beneath. "I didn't forget you," she murmured. "Not for a single day. I didn't know how to come back after so much time." Samson released a long, trembling rumble. Ranger answered with a soft, aching whine. Linda pressed her forehead against the glass, tears sliding silently down her face. Grace's breaths grew slower, shallower. She didn't fight it. "Thank you," she whispered to both of them. "For waiting? For remembering." Her hand slipped from Ranger's head and came to rest lightly atop Samson's fur, fingers curling softly. Ranger let out a sharp, mournful sound, short, almost like the alert bark he once used to warn his handlers when a suspect collapsed. Samson responded with a low, broken noise, lifting his head just enough to press it against her still hand. Grace drew one final breath, and then, gently, quietly, she let it go. Ranger bowed his head against her chest. Samson lowered his massive frame until he lay flush to her side, as if trying to hold her warm for just a few seconds longer. No one in the observation corridor moved. Not the vets, not the orderlies, not Linda, who braced her hands against the glass as the weight of the moment broke her. Minutes passed. Then an hour. They let Samson stay. He wouldn't leave her, and no one had the heart to try to force him. He lay with his head against her still shoulder, occasionally nudging her with his nose as though waiting for her to wake up. Ranger didn't move either. He lay pressed against her hip, his breathing rough, his body shaking with a grief no one needed explained. When staff finally separated them, slowly, gently, Samson walked back to his enclosure without protest, as though the last of his strength had gone with her. Ranger followed Linda home that night and curled up on the old armchair where Grace had always sat. 7 weeks later, Samson passed in his sleep. A month after that, Ranger lay down at the foot of Grace's empty bed and didn't rise again. Boise Wildlife Park later installed a plaque at the edge of the veterinary wing. Nothing grand, just a simple brass plate with 3 names: Grace Miller, 1947, 2025; Samson the Tiger, 2005, 2025; Ranger, retired, K-9, 2013, 2025, and beneath them, loyalty remembers, even when time forgets. Visitors still pause there. Some wipe their eyes. Some stand quietly. And some walk away whispering they'd never seen a love story quite like it, between a woman, a tiger she once saved, and a dog who stood beside her until her very last breath. If this story touched your heart, let me know with the simplest comment you can think of. Just type 0 or 1 down below. Anything to tell me you're here and you're listening. And if you'd like more gentle, heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more true-to-life moments, many more bonds, and many more journeys waiting for you in the next episodes. Thank you for spending your time with this story. I hope you'll stay for the next one.